The gun was already out when Shelby saw it. Black metal sliding from under a dark jacket, barrel rising toward the back of Forge's head. 15 feet of sticky bar floor between them. The president of the Iron Wolves MC sat in his usual corner booth, mid-laugh, completely unaware that he had 7 seconds left to live. Shelby's dish tub hit the floor. Plastic cups scattered. Soapy water spread across the checkered linoleum. Her feet were moving before her brain caught up. One step. The worn soles of her sneakers slapped against floorboards, stained by 40 years of spilled bourbon and cigarette smoke. Her hands were still wet from the dish pit. Steam from the industrial sink had curled her hair into damp spirals against her neck, and she could feel the heat leaving her skin as she moved through the cold air of the barroom. 2 steps. 3 men had walked into Whistler's Roadhouse at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and Shelby Calloway had known immediately they were wrong. She had learned to read violence the way most kids learn to read books. 12 different foster homes will teach you which footsteps mean danger, which voices carry threats, which silences come before someone gets hurt. 3 steps. These men moved like predators, 2 deliberate, spreading out with practiced coordination. One blocking the door, one drifting toward the pool tables where Sully and Boone were arguing about a scratch shot, the third walking straight toward Forge's booth with murder in his pocket and nothing in his eyes that resembled hesitation. 4 steps. Shelby was 17 years old. She weighed 112 pounds after a meal which she hadn't had since the leftover chicken strips Darla slid her at the start of her shift 6 hours ago. Her left knee still ached from sleeping curled in the back seat of her Honda Civic, where the upholstery had worn through to springs that dug into her thigh no matter how she positioned herself. 5 steps. She shouldn't have been here. Should have been in a dorm room somewhere studying for exams, complaining about cafeteria food with roommates who would become lifelong friends. Should have been living the life that ended 2 years ago on a rain-slicked highway outside of Decatur when a semi-truck jackknifed across 3 lanes and turned her parents' sedan into something unrecognizable. But that life belonged to a different girl. The girl Shelby had been before the system stripped her down to instinct and hunger, and the ability to read a room faster than anyone in it. 6 steps. Brick Forge's VP saw her first. His eyes went wide. His mouth opened to shout something that would arrive too late to matter. Forge was starting to turn in the booth, some deep-buried instinct prickling at the base of his skull, even though he couldn't see what was coming for him. 7. Shelby launched herself through the air. She hit Forge's broad back with everything she had, all 112 pounds of desperation and bone driving the big man sideways out of the booth. The gunshot cracked the world in half. Sound became violence, louder than anything Shelby had ever heard, louder than the transformer that had exploded next to her second foster home when she was 13, louder than the semi-truck's horn in the seconds before it killed her parents. The bullet punched through her left side. Not a sting, not a burn, a force that tore through muscle and grazed bone like she was made of paper. Heat followed, spreading through her chest like someone had poured gasoline into her lungs and struck a match. She and Forge crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs. The linoleum was cold against her cheek, colder than the morning she woke up in the Honda with frost on the windows and her breath clouding the air above the folded-down back seat. More gunshots erupted around them. Different weapons, deeper sounds. Bikers returning fire. Glass shattered. Darla screamed from behind the bar. Someone was shouting orders, but Shelby couldn't hear words anymore. Just noise washing over her in waves that seemed to come from farther and farther away. She tried to breathe. Her chest wouldn't cooperate. Each attempt brought a bubbling wetness instead of air, a sound that frightened her more than the gunshot had. Something inside her was torn collapse, filling with fluid that tasted like copper pennies when it rose into her throat. Then Forge's face was there, right in front of hers. The president had rolled them both behind the booth for cover. His hands pressed something against her chest. His leather vest, she realized. The vest he'd torn from his own back. His hands were shaking. This man who never shook. This mountain who had survived decades of territory wars and roadside ambushes and 3 separate stretches in federal prison. His hands trembled against her chest, trying to hold life inside a girl he barely knew. "Why'd you do that?" His voice cracked open on the question. Tears ran into his gray beard, catching in the deep lines around his mouth. "Why, kid?" Shelby had 46 reasons. 46 $20 bills hidden in an envelope under the spare tire in her 1998 Honda Civic. The car she had been sleeping in for 8 months parked behind the Safeway with permission from a night manager named Kip, who understood what it meant to have nowhere left to go. Every Thursday for 6 months, Forge had walked into Whistler's Roadhouse, ordered the same bacon cheeseburger, and tipped Shelby $20 for a $7 meal. $20 meant she ate that week. $20 meant she was another step closer to first month's rent on a studio apartment. Combined with what she scraped together washing dishes at $7.25 an hour, she had exactly $1,847 in that envelope. Almost enough. Almost there. Almost to the place where she wouldn't be 17 and homeless and invisible. The first time they spoke, Shelby had been clearing a booth destroyed by a birthday party. Chicken wing bones scattered across the table, beer soaked into vinyl seats, ketchup smeared on the wall in shapes that might have been intentional. This massive biker had slid into the adjacent booth, all leather and road dust and tattoos that climbed his neck like ivy on a condemned building, and he'd looked at her with gray eyes that saw too much. "You eating today, kid?" Not "how are you," not "what's your name," just the one question that mattered. Shelby had frozen. In foster care, questions from adults always came with wrong answers attached. Saying yes meant they'd stop paying attention. Saying no meant they'd make a note in your file and move on to the next kid. "I'm good," she had lied. She had eaten half a gas station sandwich for lunch, and her stomach had been cramping for hours. The kind of cramps that came from hunger working on an empty system grinding against itself with nothing to process. Forge had stared at her, those gray eyes moving across her face like he was reading a document written in a language only he understood. Then he waved Darla over and ordered 2 burgers, extra fries, told her to bring both plates to the dish girl. "Eat," Forge said. "You're no good to anyone if you pass out in the pit." That was 6 months ago. Since then, Forge showed up every Thursday. Same booth, same burger, same $20 tip. Sometimes he asked how she was doing, never pried, never lectured, never tried to fix her or save her or make himself feel better about the world by treating her like a charity case. He just showed up, week after week. The only consistent thing in Shelby's life, besides hunger and the 3 a.m. anxiety that jerked her awake in the back seat of the Honda, heart pounding, wondering how long she could keep this going before someone noticed and called whatever agency handled 17-year-olds with nowhere to go. She knew Forge had lost a son. Darla had mentioned it once during a slow shift, her voice dropping the way people's voices always drop when they talk about dead children. Dylan, overdose, 3 years ago, 19 years old, found in a motel bathroom with a needle still in his arm. Forge never talked about it, but sometimes Shelby caught him watching her with an expression that felt like grief wearing a leather jacket. Like maybe when he looked at her, he saw a second chance at something he had failed the first time. A kid he could show up for before the clock ran out. Now Shelby tried to answer his question. Tried to say because you showed up when nobody else did. Tried to say because $20 every Thursday meant I could eat. Tried to say because you looked at me like I mattered, and nobody had done that since my mother was alive. But blood came up instead of words. Warm and wrong, drowning her from the inside. Around them, the chaos was ending. Brick had one shooter zip-tied on the floor, face pressed against the linoleum, blood leaking from a broken nose. Sully had another pinned against the wall near the jukebox arm, twisted behind his back, at an angle that suggested things were already broken. The third man had escaped out the back door, slipping through the kitchen while gunsmoke still hung in the air. Sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. Red and blue lights would be strobing through the window soon. Shelby could feel the vibration of them through the floor. Or maybe that was her own heartbeat slowing, growing irregular, stumbling over itself like a drunk trying to find its way home. Forge's hands pressed harder against her chest. The leather vest was soaked through. Blood spread between his fingers no matter how much pressure he applied. His jaw was clenched so tight that she could see the muscles jumping beneath his beard. "Stay with me," he said. His voice was rough and broken and desperate. "Stay with me, sweetheart. Help is coming. Just stay with me." Then a different word, one that cut through the pain and the darkness in the distant sound of sirens, like a blade through silk. "Stay with me, daughter." Nobody had ever called Shelby that. Her father's name wasn't listed on her birth certificate. The men in foster homes were either too tired, too drunk, or too busy with their own biological children to pretend she belonged. Social workers called her Shelby or Kiddo or Sweetie placeholder, words that meant nothing and disappeared the moment the case file closed. She had been a case number in some cosmic filing system, a line item, a checkbox, a problem to be managed until she aged out and became someone else's problem, or no one's. Forge called her daughter. Shelby wanted to hold on to that word, wanted to wrap it around herself like the blanket she didn't have. The one that would have kept her warm on those February nights in the Honda, when the cold crept through the cracked window seal and frost formed on the inside of the glass, and she slept in every piece of clothing she owned, her mother's hospital bracelet pressed against her wrist, because it was the only warmth from her old life she could still carry. She wanted to ask if Forge meant it. If daughter was just something you said when someone was dying in your arms, a reflex born of terror and grief, or if it was real, if it was a claim. If it meant Shelby finally belonged to someone in a world that had spent 17 years telling her she didn't. But her vision was blurring. Darkness crept in from the edges. The bar sounds were fading. The jukebox that had been playing old Waylon Jennings. The crash of pool balls from a game that would never be finished. Darla's voice on the phone with 911 high and tight with fear. Everything got distant and muffled, like Shelby was sinking through deep water toward a bottom she couldn't see. Her mother's hospital bracelet was wrapped around the rearview mirror in the Civic, a thin plastic band with Margaret Calloway printed in faded blue ink and a 16-digit patient number below it. The only artifact from the life that ended on that rain-slicked highway. No grandparents who wanted her, no aunts or uncles who returned the social worker's calls. Just a plastic bracelet in a car that smelled like exhaust, in the memory of her mother's hands braiding her hair on Sunday mornings, singing hymns she half remembered in a kitchen that no longer existed. Shelby thought about the envelope under the spare tire. $1,847. She had counted it last night before falling asleep in the back seat, body curled into itself for warmth, knees pulled to her chest, sneakers still on because you never knew when you might need to run. So close to enough. So close to a studio apartment with heat that worked, and a door that locked, and a bed that wasn't a folded-down car seat with springs that bit. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the big man cradling her against his chest, calling her daughter, refusing to let go even as blood soaked through his shirt and hers and pooled on the floor beneath him in a spreading dark mirror that reflected nothing. "You said family shows up," Shelby whispered. Each word cost her something she couldn't name. Something vital and irreplaceable draining out with the air that wasn't reaching her lungs. Blood bubbled between her lips. Forge made a sound that split the difference between a moan and a roar. He gathered her closer, careful of the wound, but holding her like she was something he'd been waiting his whole life to find and was now losing before he'd even had the chance to understand what it meant. "Your family," he said. Tears streamed down his face, disappearing into his gray beard. "You hear me? You're my family. You're my dater. Don't you leave me. Don't you dare leave me." The ambulance was 4 blocks away, maybe 3 minutes out. Shelby could hear the siren getting louder, that distinctive wail cutting through the night. Paramedics would come running through the door with their equipment and their training and their practiced urgency. They would do everything in their power to save a 17-year-old girl who had thrown herself in front of a bullet for a biker who tipped her $20 every Thursday. But Shelby didn't have 3 minutes. The darkness was pulling her down, cold and absolute, impatient in the way only death can be patient. Her chest barely moved. The bubbling sound when she tried to breathe was growing quieter, and some distant clinical part of her brain understood that quieter meant worse. Meant her body was surrendering a fight it didn't have the reserves to win. The last thing Shelby saw was Forge's face streaked with tears, his mouth moving with words she could no longer hear. The last thing she felt was being wanted, being chosen, being claimed by someone who had looked at her and decided she mattered, even though the world had spent 17 years insisting she didn't. For 17 years, Shelby Calloway had been invisible. A foster kid shuttled between strangers' homes until the system ran out of patience and released her into a world that had no place for her. A dishwasher who slept in a car and counted $20 bills like they were messages from God. But in 7 steps between a dish pit and a corner booth, in the half second, It took her to launch herself into the path of a bullet. Shelby became something else. She became someone worth crying for, someone worth calling daughter. The darkness took her completely. Her hand went limp in Forge's grip. The bubbling stopped. Outside, the ambulance turned onto Prescott Street, 2 minutes away. Inside Whistler's Roadhouse, a 62-year-old president of the Iron Wolves MC held a dying girl against his chest and prayed to a God he hadn't spoken to since they lowered his son into the ground 3 years ago. And in that moment, neither of them knew that what Shelby had just done would bring 260 motorcycles to a hospital parking lot. That rival clubs who had been spilling each other's blood for decades would stand together in her name. That a 17-year-old nobody would teach hardened outlaws what brotherhood actually meant. All Forge knew was that his hands were covered in blood, and the girl who had saved his life was slipping away, and the word daughter kept breaking on his lips like a promise he was terrified he wouldn't get to keep. The paramedics hit the door at 11:59, 12 minutes after the first 911 call. 12 minutes that had felt like 12 years to Forge kneeling on blood-soaked linoleum with Shelby limp in his arms. The EMTs were professionals. They'd seen gunshot wounds before, seen dying kids before, seen desperate men covered in blood begging them to do something, anything, whatever it took. But when the lead paramedic, a woman named Beckett, with 23 years on the brain, saw the amount of blood pooled on the floor, her face went tight in a way that made Forge's stomach drop through the earth. "Single GSW to the left chest," Beckett said to her partner, already moving. "Probable hemothorax. Patient is unresponsive. Get the backboard." They worked fast. Cut away Shelby's shirt, started an IV line, strapped an oxygen mask over her face, which had gone gray in a way that made her look decades older than 17. Her lips had turned blue, the particular blue that Forge had seen on dead men in prison yards and roadside ditches, the blue that meant oxygen wasn't reaching the places it needed to go. "Is she breathing?" Forge asked. He was still on his knees, his hands hung at his sides now, useless, stripped of the only purpose they'd had for the last 12 minutes. "Barely," Beckett said. She didn't sugarcoat it, didn't offer false hope or gentle platitudes, just stated the fact while her hands moved with an efficiency born of 2 decades spent racing against clocks she couldn't see. "Collapsed lung, maybe worse. We need to move. Now." They lifted Shelby onto the stretcher. Her arm fell off the side, dangling, so thin. Forge hadn't realized how thin she was until this moment, seeing her with her clothes cut away, ribs visible under skin that looked translucent against all that blood. How long had she been starving herself to save money? How many meals had she skipped so she could add another 20 to that envelope she thought nobody knew about? Forge had known, had suspected at least. He'd seen the way she ate when food appeared in front of her, fast and focused like someone who'd learned that meals could be taken away without warning. He'd noticed how her clothes hung loose on a frame that was already small. The dark half-moons under her eyes that spoke of sleep that never quite arrived or didn't last long enough to count. He told himself it wasn't his business. Told himself that $20 a week and a question about whether she'd eaten was enough, that he was doing his part, that you couldn't save everyone and shouldn't try because trying meant caring, and caring meant losing, and losing meant feeling the thing he'd sworn he would never feel again after Dylan. It hadn't been enough. $20 in a weekly question hadn't been nearly enough. Forge followed the stretcher to the ambulance. Brick tried to stop him at the door. "Boss, the cops are going to want statements. The 2 shooters are zip-tied in the back. We need to." Forge shoved past without a word. "Let the police wait. Let the lawyers and the paperwork and the entire machinery of justice wait." Shelby had thrown herself in front of a bullet meant for his skull. The least he could do was be there when she either lived or died. "Family only," Beckett said when Forge tried to climb into the ambulance. "I'm her father." The lie came without hesitation, without thought. It emerged from some place deeper than strategy, deeper than self-preservation. It came from the same place that had made him order 2 burgers 6 months ago, when he'd looked into a 17-year-old girl's eyes and seen hunger she was too proud to admit. Beckett looked at him, took in the leather, the patches, the blood, the tattoos that covered his arms and climbed his neck. "President of the Iron Wolves MC." Then she looked at Shelby, 17 and alone, and dying on a stretcher with nothing to her name except a rusting Honda and an envelope full of $20 bills. Something in Beckett's face shifted, a calculation that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with mercy. "Get in," she said. The ride to St. Catherine's took 8 minutes. Forge counted every second sitting on the narrow bench with his back against the ambulance wall, watching the monitors that beeped and flashed numbers he didn't understand. Watching Beckett and her partner work over Shelby with a controlled urgency that somehow felt worse than panic would have. Panic meant surprise. This was practiced, routine. They had done this before. They knew how it usually ended. "BP's dropping," the partner said. 80/40. "Push the fluids," Beckett ordered. Then she looked at Forge. "When did she last eat?" "I don't know." The admission tasted like ash. "She works at the bar. I see her Thursdays. She always looks hungry." "Malnourished," Beckett murmured more to herself than to him. Her eyes moved across Shelby's exposed torso, cataloging things Forge didn't want to think about. "That's not helping. Her body doesn't have the reserves to fight with." Forge stared at Shelby's face behind the oxygen mask. This girl had been starving, sleeping in a car, working for $7.25 an hour, and saving every penny for an apartment she might never see the inside of. And he'd known. He'd known something was wrong, had felt it in his gut every Thursday when she cleared his plate with hands that trembled slightly from blood sugar that never quite stabilized. And he'd told himself that a weekly 20 was sufficient, that asking was enough without acting, that the distance between concern and responsibility was wide enough to absolve him. The ambulance bounced over a pothole. Shelby's body shifted on the stretcher. The monitors spiked, then settled. The oxygen mask fogged with breath so shallow it barely registered. Forge thought about Dylan, thought about the last time he had told himself that showing up occasionally was enough, that checking in was the same as being present. His son had died alone in a motel bathroom at 19 because Forge had been too busy running the club, too wrapped up in territory and business, and the 1,000 small wars that kept the Iron Wolves relevant. He'd visited Dylan once a month at the halfway house, called every Sunday. Thought that was sufficient. It hadn't been sufficient then, and it wasn't sufficient now. Shelby Calloway was bleeding out on a stretcher because the only man who'd noticed she was starving had decided that noticing was enough. They burst through the emergency room doors at 12:07. A trauma team was already waiting. 2 doctors, 3 nurses, all of them moving in synchronized precision the moment the stretcher cleared the ambulance bay. They rolled Shelby straight into trauma room 1. Forge tried to follow, but a nurse planted a hand on his chest. "You need to wait outside." "That's my daughter." "Then wait outside and let us save her." The door swung shut. Through the narrow window, Forge could see them working, swarming Shelby's body on the table, cutting away the last of her clothes, shouting medical terms across the room in voices that were loud but never panicked. One doctor positioned an ultrasound wand against Shelby's chest. Another prepared a scalpel. A nurse hung bags of blood on a pole. O negative. The universal donor, because there was no time to determine her blood type, no time for anything except the raw, urgent mechanics of keeping a 17-year-old girl alive long enough to figure out what was broken inside her. Forge's phone buzzed. "Brick," he answered without looking away from the window. "What?" "Cops have the 2 shooters in custody. Third one rabbited out the back. Got a partial plate from the kitchen camera." A pause. "You okay?" "No." "The girl?" "They're working on her." Forge's voice splintered on the words. "There's so much blood, Brick, too much." Silence on the line. Then, "I'm calling the chapter. We're coming." "You don't need to." "We're coming," Brick repeated. "That girl took your bullet. That makes her ours." The line went dead. Forge pressed his forehead against the window and watched the doctors fight for Shelby's life. One of them was doing something to her chest, inserting a tube between her ribs. Even unconscious Shelby's body recoiled at the invasion. Blood and fluid drained through the tube into a collection chamber that filled with horrifying speed. Her lung had been drowning her from the inside. Every breath she tried to take in Forge's arms had been pushing fluid deeper into tissue that was already failing. The doctor with the ultrasound looked up from her screen and spoke to the surgeon. Forge couldn't hear the words, but he could read the urgency in the way they moved. Faster now, more hands reaching for instruments, more monitors being attached. The organized dance of trauma medicine accelerating toward a tempo that meant things were going wrong. A young doctor, maybe 35, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that carried the weight of too many nights like this, noticed Forge at the window. She stepped away from the table and cracked the door open. "Are you family?" "I'm her father," Forge said. Third time. The lie had calcified into something that felt indistinguishable from truth. "She's critical," the doctor said. Her name badge read Dr. Pemberton. "The bullet collapsed her left lung and nicked her subclavian artery. We're stabilizing her for surgery, but it's going to be close." She paused. "Does she have any other family we should contact?" "No, just me." Dr. Pemberton nodded. Something in her expression suggested she understood more than the words conveyed. "We'll update you when we know more. Right now we're focused on keeping her stable enough to get to the OR." She disappeared back into the trauma bay. Through the window, Forge watched them continue their work. Watched Shelby's chest rise and fall, but only because a machine was forcing it to. Watched the monitors trace patterns that looked erratic and uncertain, like a heartbeat, trying to decide whether it wanted to continue. His phone buzzed again. Text from Brick. "On our way. 15 bikes, then another." From Sully, the road captain. "Heard what happened. Bringing the crew." Then Boone. "Riding now. 20 minutes out." The messages kept arriving. Brothers from across the chapter all converging on St. Catherine's Hospital in the middle of the night. Not because Forge had ordered them, not because protocol demanded it, because a 17-year-old dishwasher had done what brotherhood was supposed to mean, had thrown herself into danger to protect someone else without asking what it would cost. At 12:34, the trauma team moved Shelby out of the bay. The stretcher rolled toward the elevators, surrounded by equipment and personnel, a mobile command center of tubes and monitors and bags of blood. Forge caught a glimpse of her face as they passed. Still gray, still unconscious, still caught in the space between alive and something else. "OR's ready," one of the doctors said. "We're taking her up." "How long?" Forge asked. "However long it takes. Could be 6 hours. Could be more." The elevator doors closed. Shelby disappeared behind stainless steel, and Forge stood in an empty hallway that smelled of antiseptic and fluorescent light. His hands still crusted with her blood, his vest still soaked through from the minutes he'd spent pressing leather against the hole in her chest, trying to hold her life in with nothing but pressure and desperation and a word he hadn't used in 3 years. "Daughter." He found the men's room, turned on the faucet. The water ran red, then pink, then clear. But he could still feel it. The warmth of her blood against his palms, the bubbling wetness of her breathing. The precise moment when the bubbling stopped and silence replaced it, a silence more terrifying than any gunshot. When Forge looked in the mirror, he saw a man he barely recognized. Hollow-eyed, gray-faced, old in a way that had nothing to do with the calendar and everything to do with the weight of standing in the exact same place he had sworn he would never stand again. He had lost Dylan 3 years ago. Overdose, 19 years old. Forge had found him in that motel bathroom outside of Kingman, needle still in his arm, eyes open, staring at the ceiling with an expression that looked almost peaceful, as if dying had been the first easy thing his son had done in years. Forge had gathered Dylan's body against his chest and screamed until his voice gave out, had cursed a God he didn't believe in, had sworn in the wreckage of that moment that he would never feel that particular devastation again, had locked the part of himself that knew how to love a child behind a door made of anger and numbness and the daily business of running an outlaw motorcycle club. Then Shelby Calloway had appeared. This quiet girl in the dish pit at Whistler's. This invisible kid that nobody wanted and nobody saw and nobody thought twice about except on Thursdays when Forge slid into his booth and ordered a burger he didn't always want, just so he'd have a reason to look at her and ask the question that mattered. "You eating today, kid?" Without Forge even realizing it was happening, the locked door had opened. He'd started showing up on Thursdays not for the chapter meeting that followed, but to check on her. Started leaving 20s not because the service justified it, but because he could see the cost of hunger in the hollows of her cheeks, in the way her hands shook when she carried heavy trays. Started asking about her day because he needed to know that someone was watching out for this girl, and if the rest of the world wouldn't, then he would. He'd called her daughter on that bar floor. With bullets flying and blood spreading and sirens getting closer, Forge had called her daughter and meant it with every cell in his body. Now she might die before he got the chance to say it again when she could actually hear it. The waiting room was on the fourth floor. Forge took the stairs because standing still felt like surrender. When he pushed through the stairwell door, the space was empty except for a security guard doing crosswords and a television mounted on the wall playing late-night news with the sound off. 12:47. Shelby had been in surgery for 13 minutes. His phone buzzed. "Brick, we're here. Parking lot is full. Where do you want us?" Then Sully, "More brothers incoming. Word is spreading fast." Then a message that made Forge stop breathing, from a number he recognized but hadn't seen in months. Hawk, president of the Reapers MC, their most bitter rival. 15 years of bad blood bar fights in a territory war that had put two of Forge's men in the hospital last spring. Heard about the girl, heard what she did. "My boys want to come pay respects." "Will there be trouble?" Forge stared at the message for a long time. Then he typed two words. "Come through." At 1:03 in the morning, the first engines rumbled into the St. Catharines parking lot. Forge heard them from the fourth floor, that deep Harley thunder that could vibrate through concrete and steel and settle in your chest like a second heartbeat. He walked to the window and looked down. 15 bikes pulling into spaces near the emergency entrance. His brothers, Brick, Sully Boone, and a dozen others. They killed their engines and stood beside their motorcycles looking up at the hospital like they could see through 4 floors of brick and glass to the operating room where one of their own was being cut open and stitched back together. One of their own, that was what she had become, not through initiation or a vote or any of the rituals that govern membership, through 7 steps and a bullet and the kind of courage that couldn't be taught or earned through dues and loyalty oaths. At 1:17, more bikes arrived. 20 this time, different patches. The Reaper's MC Hawk himself was at the front of the formation, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a silver streak in his beard and hands that had broken bones belonging to Iron Wolves members. He parked his bike and stood beside it, looking up at the hospital with an expression Forge couldn't read from 4 stories above. Brick walked across the parking lot toward Hawk. Forge watched from the window, his muscles tensing, half expecting violence. These two clubs had been at war for years. Their last encounter had ended with a Reaper's jaw wired shut and one of Brick's ribs cracked. Instead, Brick extended his hand. Hawk took it. They shook, then pulled each other into a brief, hard embrace. Two men from rival clubs standing together under hospital floodlights, because a girl who belonged to neither of them had shown them what the word brother was supposed to mean. At 1:45, the Desert Saints showed up. 30 bikes. Their president, a 64-year-old man called Preacher, who'd earned the name by delivering eulogies at every club funeral for 40 years, led the formation in with military precision. Then the Road to Sentinels at 2:12, then the Thunder Ridge MC at 2:34, then the Granite Suns at 3:08, then the Western Guardians at 3:41. Clubs that had spent years hating each other. Clubs with grudges that ran deeper than memory and violence that had left permanent scars on both sides. All of them parking their bikes in neat rows and standing beside them in the November cold breath, fogging under parking lot lights, watching the hospital windows as if their collective gaze could reach through walls and hold a girl steady on an operating table. The waiting room filled. Bikers in leather vests with different patches and different colors and different histories of mutual harm sat in plastic chairs designed for people half their size and said nothing. They nodded to Forge when they arrived, acknowledged him with the respect that one president owed another. But nobody spoke. The silence was its own language. It said, "We're here." It said, "She matters." It said, "This changes things." At 3:28, a nurse appeared looking for Forge. Her name tag read Ruth Ann. She was in her 50s with steel gray hair pinned back and hands that moved with the calm of someone who had spent 32 years navigating the worst nights of other people's lives. "Are you Shelby Calloway's father?" Yes, no hesitation. Not anymore. It was simply true. "She's still in surgery. Dr. Pemberton wanted me to tell you that it's going well, but they found more damage than the initial scans showed. Her lung required partial resection. They're repairing the artery now, which is the most delicate part." Ruth Ann paused, choosing her words. "The next hour is critical." "Is she going to make it?" Ruth Ann had been doing this long enough to know that honesty was a kindness even when it hurt. They're doing everything they can. At 4:15, more bikes arrived, 50 this time. Word had spread across state lines through phone trees and group chats, and the informal network that connected the motorcycle world like a root system buried beneath the surface of polite society. Clubs from 2 states over were riding through the darkness to reach a hospital where a girl they'd never met was fighting for her life. The parking lot was overflowing. Security had tried to manage the situation at first, asking bikers to move, citing fire codes and visitor policies. They'd given up around 3 in the morning when it became clear that the men filling their parking lot outnumbered their entire shift by a factor of 20 and showed no signs of causing trouble. Just standing, waiting, a vigil that grew larger with every passing hour. At 6:47, dawn broke over St. Catherine's Hospital. The parking lot held 160 motorcycles, chrome and steel and leather stretching across the asphalt in neat rows that caught the early light and threw it back in fragments. Rival clubs stood shoulder to shoulder. Some had fallen asleep, sitting against their bikes, chins tucked to their chests, hands still resting on fuel tanks. Others stood in small groups sharing coffee from thermoses and speaking in low voices about a girl none of them had known existed 12 hours ago. A local news van had appeared around 5:30. Channel 7. A reporter and a cameraman filming the scene from the street, capturing the impossible image of 7 rival motorcycle clubs standing together in silent agreement. Forge stood at the 4th-floor window and watched the sunrise paint everything below him in shades of amber and copper. Shelby had been in surgery for 6 hours and 13 minutes. His phone buzzed. Text from Dr. Pemberton. Coming to talk to you, 2 minutes. Forge's heart stopped. Coming to talk to you could mean anything. Could mean the surgery was over and Shelby was breathing on her own. Could mean they'd done everything they could and it hadn't been enough. Could mean he was about to hear the same words a doctor had tried to say to him 3 years ago in a hospital in Kingman, words he'd refused to let the man finish, because finishing them would make Dylan's death real and permanent and beyond the reach of his rage. The waiting room had gone silent. Every biker in the room was watching Forge's face, reading his expression, waiting for news about the girl who had reminded all of them what their patches were supposed to stand for. Dr. Pemberton pushed through the double doors. Her scrubs were dark with blood, Shelby's blood. She pulled her surgical mask down and her face was a wall, exhausted, drawn, deliberately neutral in a way that gave nothing away. "Mr. Crenshaw," she said. Forge stood. His legs felt unreliable. Around him, bikers rose to their feet in a single movement, like a congregation standing for a hymn. Dr. Pemberton looked at Forge with eyes that carried the weight of 6 hours of surgery and a career spent delivering news that changed the shape of people's lives. "Your daughter survived the surgery." The room exhaled, a single collective release of breath that sounded almost like wind. Someone behind Forge whispered, "Thank God," in a voice that cracked on both words. "But," Dr. Pemberton said, and that single word turned the room to stone. The next 48 hours are critical. She lost a massive amount of blood. Her body went through extraordinary trauma. We've repaired the artery, reinflated the lung, addressed the internal damage. But whether she wakes up depends on her now. She needs to fight. Dr. Pemberton paused. When she spoke again, her clinical composure wavered just slightly. And honestly, looking at her medical history, at her physical condition, the malnutrition, the signs of chronic stress and sleep deprivation, she doesn't have much to fight for, does she? Forge turned to the window, looked down at the parking lot filled with motorcycles, at the men who had ridden through the night, at rival clubs standing together in dawn light that made their chrome look like gold. "She does now," he said. Dr. Pemberton followed his gaze, saw what was waiting below. Her eyes widened. "That's all for her, every single one." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You can see her in an hour, ICU, 2 visitors at a time." She started to leave, then stopped and turned back. "That girl must be something extraordinary." "She is," Forge said. "She just doesn't know it yet." At 7:52, they let Forge into the ICU. Shelby lay in a bed surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed and performed the basic functions her body couldn't manage on its own. Tubes ran from her mouth, her chest, her arms. Wires connected her to monitors that displayed her heartbeat in green peaks and valleys. Her skin was still gray, though not the terrible gray of the barroom floor. A lighter shade closer to living. Her chest rose and fell, but only because a ventilator pushed air into lungs that weren't ready to work alone. She looked small, impossibly small in that hospital bed surrounded by all that machinery. Like a child lost in a world built for adults, which was exactly what she was and exactly what she had always been. Forge sat in the plastic chair beside her bed, took her hand. It was cold, but he could feel a pulse in her wrist. Faint, steady, stubborn like everything else about her. "You fight," he whispered. "You hear me, kid? You fight. Because you got 160 brothers downstairs who rode through the night for you. Clubs that haven't spoken a civil word to each other in 20 years, standing in the same parking lot because of what you did. You've got a family now, you've got me. So you don't give up, you don't quit." Shelby didn't move, didn't respond. The ventilator cycled through its rhythm. The monitors beeped their steady mechanical assurance that her heart was still beating, still working, still deciding. Forge sat there through the morning, holding her hand, watching the monitors, counting heartbeats the way he had counted seconds in the ambulance. Nurses came and went, checked tubes, adjusted settings, made notes on charts. They were kind to him, brought him coffee he didn't drink, offered food he couldn't eat. Told him she was stable, which was a word that meant alive but carried none of the certainty he needed. At 8:34, his phone erupted with notifications. He looked at the screen and his breath caught. The news story had gone viral. The image of 160 motorcycles from rival clubs filling a hospital parking lot. The headline, "Bikers Unite for Teen Who Took Bullet for Club President." Colleen Ashford from Channel 7 had filed the story at dawn, and by mid-morning, it was everywhere. Local stations picked it up first, then national outlets, then the internet took it and ran. Texts flooded in, more clubs asking if they could come. More brothers already on their way from chapters Forge hadn't spoken to in years. The story had traveled through the biker world and then beyond it into the broader current of human attention. Because something about the image of those motorcycles, all that chrome and leather and history of violence, transformed into a silent vigil for a teenage girl, struck a nerve that people didn't know was exposed. By noon, there were 200 bikes in the parking lot. By 3 in the afternoon, 240. By evening, 260. At 6:23 on the evening of the second day, Shelby's heart monitor flatlined. The sound was everything, a single continuous tone that erased every other sound in the room and replaced it with the audio signature of death. Not loud, almost gentle in its constancy. A note that held itself without wavering, without mercy, without end. Nurses came running. Dr. Pemberton appeared already calling orders before she was through the door. "Get the crash cart, starting compressions." Forge was pushed against the wall, forced to stand there with his back against cold plaster, watching them work over Shelby's body with a violence that was indistinguishable from love. Hands pressing hard on her sternum. A nurse ripping open packaging on defibrillator pads. Dr. Pemberton counting compressions with the metronomic focus of someone who understood that rhythm was the difference between life and permanent silence. "Charging, everyone clear." Shelby's body convulsed against the mattress. The monitor stayed flat. Again, charging. A second shock, her body arched and fell. Nothing. Again. The third shock was harder than the first two. Forge could hear the current hit her chest, a wet, percussive sound that would live in his nightmares for years. 47 seconds of flatline. 47 seconds during which Shelby Calloway was dead. During which her heart sat motionless in her damaged chest, and her blood stopped moving, and her brain began its irreversible slide toward darkness. Then a blip on the monitor, a single tentative spike, followed by another. Then a rhythm, unsteady and fragile but present, alive. Dr. Pemberton exhaled. Her hands were shaking, though her voice remained level when she spoke. "She's back, but that was too close." She looked at Forge, and for the first time he saw fear behind her professional composure. Her body is shutting down. She's fighting multiple infections. The malnutrition has left her immune system compromised. "I don't know if she can survive another episode like that." But Forge wasn't listening. He was staring at Shelby's face. Because for just a moment, just a fraction of a second before the sedatives reclaimed her, Shelby's eyes had flickered open. She had looked straight at Forge, And in that look, brief as it was, he had seen something that made him believe she could hear him after all. Recognition, decision. A 17-year-old girl choosing to come back. Outside, 260 motorcycles sat in their rows beneath hospital floodlights. 7 clubs. 7 histories of mutual violence and distrust. All of them holding position for a girl who owned nothing except a rusted Honda, an envelope full of $20 bills, and a plastic hospital bracelet that had belonged to her mother. Inside, that girl's heart beat its fragile, stubborn rhythm, and Forge stood at the window of the ICU looking down at the impossible scene below and understood that Shelby Calloway had already changed everything, had already done what decades of treaties and truces and territorial negotiations had failed to do. She had brought enemies together, not through diplomacy or force or the careful balancing of interests that kept the motorcycle world in its uneasy equilibrium. Through 7 steps, through courage that asked nothing in return, through the simple, devastating act of showing up for someone who had shown up for her. Doctor Pemberton stood beside him, following his gaze down to the parking lot. How long have they been out there? Since last night. Some of them rode 300 miles. For her. Dr. Pemberton was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, almost to herself, I've been doing this for 12 years. I've treated a lot of trauma patients. A lot of kids with no one, and the ones who make it, the ones who fight, they're usually the ones who have something to come back to. She looked at Forge. Make sure she knows what's waiting for her when she wakes up. When? Forge repeated, not if. Dr. Pemberton held his gaze. When? Forge turned back to the window. Below him, dawn was still hours away, but the parking lot was lit by halogen and headlight, and the glow of phones held by men who were texting their families, checking in with their chapters, telling the world that they were standing vigil for a 17-year-old girl who had reminded them what they were supposed to be. Shelby's heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm behind him. Each beat a small rebellion against the silence that had lasted 47 seconds. Each beat a choice. Each beat a step forward away from the darkness towards something she didn't know was waiting. 260 motorcycles, 7 clubs, 1 girl, and a man who had called her daughter and meant it, standing guard between her and the night, refusing to lose another child to a world that didn't deserve the ones it was given. Shelby Calloway opened her eyes on the 4th day and couldn't remember how to breathe without a machine doing it for her. The world came back in pieces. Fluorescent light overhead too bright, humming at a frequency that settled behind her eyes like a migraine waiting to happen. The smell of disinfectant and something else beneath it, something metallic and organic that she would later understand was her own blood, scrubbed from surfaces, but lingering in the air like a memory that refused to leave. The sound of monitors beeping in patterns that meant nothing to her but apparently meant everything, because every time the rhythm shifted, footsteps approached, and hands reached for tubes, and voices spoke in medical shorthand that sounded like a foreign language being used to describe the interior of her body. The breathing tube was still down her throat. That was the worst of it. Not the pain, which was considerable. Not the confusion, which was total. The tube. This rigid plastic intrusion that had taken over the most basic function of her existence and was now performing it with mechanical indifference, pushing air into lungs that felt like they'd been packed with wet concrete and lit on fire. Dr. Pemberton appeared above her. Dark hair, tired eyes, a mouth that was saying words Shelby couldn't quite assemble into meaning. Shelby, I'm Dr. Pemberton. You're in St. Catherine's Hospital. You were shot. We put you on a ventilator to help you breathe. If you can understand me, I need you to squeeze my hand. Shelby squeezed. Weakly, but she squeezed. Good, that's very good. Relief moved across the doctor's face like weather across a plain sky, fast and unmistakable. We're going to take the breathing tube out now. It's going to be uncomfortable, but it'll be over quickly. Uncomfortable was a generous word for what followed. The extraction felt like something essential was being pulled from the core of her, something that had grown roots while she was unconscious and was now being torn free. Shelby gagged, coughed, gasped. Air hit her raw throat like sandpaper, and for a terrible moment she couldn't draw breath at all, couldn't make her lungs work without the machine that had been running them for 4 days. Then the oxygen mask went on, and she breathed, on her own. Rough and shallow and painful each inhale, sending a wave of fire through her left side, but her lungs were functioning. damaged, diminished, but alive. "Water," she rasped. Her voice was destroyed. A stranger's voice emerging from her own throat scraped and hollowed out. They gave her ice chips. She let them melt on her tongue, and the relief was so profound that she nearly cried. When she opened her eyes again, Forge was there. He was sitting in a plastic chair pulled so close to her bed that his knees pressed against the mattress frame. His clothes were the same ones from the bar. Shelby could see the rust-colored stains on his shirt, on his jeans, on the leather vest he draped over the chair back. Her blood. 4 days old. He hadn't gone home to change. Hadn't left this room if the exhaustion carved into his face was any indication. His gray beard was unkempt, his eyes were red-rimmed, and his massive hands were clasped together in his lap, like a man who'd been holding on to something for so long that he'd forgotten how to let go. "You're alive," Shelby whispered. "Because of you, Bion," Forge said. His voice broke on the second word. "You saved my life, kid." Shelby was quiet for a moment, processing, trying to arrange the scattered fragments of memory into a sequence that made sense. The gun, the booth, 7 steps, the sound that split the world, heat and cold and falling, and Forge's hands pressing leather against her chest while his tears fell onto her face. "The men," she said, "the shooters. 2 in custody, third one got away." Shelby filed that, stored it, the way she stored every piece of information that might matter later, the way 12 foster homes had taught her to catalog threats and exits and the locations of sharp objects in unfamiliar kitchens. The third one got away. She held that fact close and felt its edges. How long was I out? 4 days. The number hit her like a fist. 4 days. 4 shifts at Whistler's. 4 nights of pay she'd never see. The calculation was automatic, running on the same desperate arithmetic that had governed her life for 8 months. $29 per shift after taxes. Times 4. $116 she couldn't afford to lose. My job. Her eyes went wide. Panic crept into her voice, which was still barely a whisper, but carried a fear more acute than anything the gunshot wound had produced. "Whistler's. I missed 4 shifts. Darla's going to fire me. I need that job. I can't." "Kid." Forge's voice was firm but gentle in a way she hadn't known his voice could be. "You don't have to worry about any of that. You're taken care of." "I don't understand." Forge stood, helped her sit up slightly, adjusting the bed with the remote, careful not to jostle the IV lines running into both arms. Then he turned her toward the window. "Look outside." Shelby looked. Even from the 4th floor of the ICU, she could see them. Rows and rows of motorcycles stretching across the parking lot in formation so precise they looked choreographed. Hundreds of them. Chrome catching the morning light and throwing it back in bursts of silver and gold. Men in leather vests standing beside their bikes. Some sleeping in camp chairs with jackets pulled over their faces. Others gathered in small circles, talking quietly, drinking coffee from paper cups. Different patches on different backs. Different colors. Different clubs. "What is that?" Shelby whispered. "That's 260 bikers from 7 different clubs," Forge said. He was standing beside her bed, looking out the window with an expression that still held disbelief even after 4 days of watching the number grow. "Rival clubs, enemies. Some of them have been trying to kill each other since before you were born. They've been standing vigil since the night you were shot. They rode from 3 states away. Some of them drove through the night, and they've been waiting for you to wake up." Shelby stared. Her eyes moved across the scene below her, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with anything she had ever experienced or imagined experiencing. 260 motorcycles. For her. For a dishwasher who slept in a Honda Civic and rationed gas station sandwiches to make $20 last a week. Why because? Because you reminded them what brotherhood means. Because you threw yourself in front of a bullet for someone you barely knew without asking what it would cost you. Because in 7 steps you did what most of these men have spent their whole lives only talking about. Tears started running down Shelby's face. She didn't try to stop them. Didn't have the energy or the pride to pretend they weren't there. "I don't even have a bike," she said. "I'm not in a club. I'm nobody." "You're not nobody." Forge's voice carried an edge that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with conviction. "You're my daughter, and you're a sister to every single man standing in that parking lot. Shelby looked at him, her eyes searching his face for the thing she'd spent 17 years looking for and never finding. The thing that told her this was real and not a dream she'd wake from, in the backseat of the Honda with frost on the windows and an empty stomach and another day of being invisible stretching out before her like a highway with no exit. "You called me that," she said quietly. "When I was on the floor, you called me daughter." "I meant it. I mean it now." Forge sat on the edge of the bed, careful of her tubes and wires. "If you'll have me, I want to be your family Shelby. I know I'm not much. I know my life is complicated and my history is worse. But I want to be there for you, not just on Thursdays, every day." Shelby couldn't speak, just cried. Silently, the way she'd learned to cry in foster homes where noise attracted attention, and attention was never the kind you wanted. This girl who had spent 17 years alone, who had never belonged to anyone, who had saved every penny for a studio apartment because 4 walls and a locking door were the most ambitious future she could imagine. While Shelby slept through the afternoon, Forge told her what she'd missed. Colleen Ashford from Channel 7 had come to the hospital on day 3 and asked him to tell the story on camera. He'd sat in the conference room, still wearing his blood-stained clothes, and told the world about a 17-year-old dishwasher who'd thrown herself in front of a bullet for a man who tipped her $20. He'd called her his daughter on national television and meant every syllable. Dr. Pemberton came in later to check her vitals, adjusted the IV drip, changed the dressing on her chest wound, which Shelby refused to look at, told her to rest. But before she left, Dr. Pemberton paused at the door. "There's something else you should know, Shelby. Your story went viral. Your father's interview has been viewed over 2 million times. People have been donating money. As of this morning, there's a fund with $42,000 set aside for your medical bills and recovery." Shelby stared at her. The number didn't connect to anything in her experience. $42,000. She had spent 8 months counting 20s in a Honda Civic, doing math in her head before every purchase, calculating whether she could afford a gas station sandwich or whether that $3.79 needed to stay in the envelope under the spare tire. 42,000 was a number from a world she didn't live in. "That's not real," she said. "That can't be real." "It's very real. You're a hero, Shelby. The whole country is watching." Dr. Pemberton left. Shelby lay back against the pillows, overwhelmed and exhausted, her mind running in circles it couldn't close. Forge told her to rest. The pain medication was pulling her towards sleep, a thick chemical gravity that softened the edges of everything and made the monitor's beeping sound almost musical. But before she went under, she said something that turned Forge's blood to ice. "The third shooter." Her words were slurring consciousness, losing its grip. "The one who got away. He saw my face, Forge. I saw his. Scar from his left ear to his jaw. He knows I can identify him." Her eyes were closing, but she fought to keep them open for one more sentence. One more thought. The threat assessment that ran constantly in the background of her mind, like software that never shut down. "He won't come through the front door. Not with all those bikers outside. He'll wait for a night shift. Skeleton crew. Dressed like hospital staff. Lab coat or scrubs, something with a clipboard. Nobody questions a clipboard." Her voice was fading. "And he won't use a gun. Too loud. He needs it to look natural. Something in an IV line. Something that stops a heart." Then she was asleep. And Forge sat in the plastic chair beside her bed, staring at this 17-year-old girl who had just described her own assassination with the calm, analytical precision of someone who had spent her entire life thinking like a person being hunted. Because she had 12 foster homes, 12 sets of strangers, 12 kitchens full of knives, and 12 bedrooms with doors that didn't always lock, and 12 lessons in how to identify the footsteps that meant danger was coming down the hallway. Shelby Calloway had never stopped being hunted. She'd just gotten better at predicting what the hunters would do. Forge pulled out his phone and called Brick. The call went out within the hour, not just to the Iron Wolves, but to every club president standing vigil in the parking lot. Forge explained it simply. The third shooter was coming back. The girl had told him how and when. They needed to be ready. The response was immediate and unanimous. Hawk and the Reapers took responsibility for the south entrance. Preacher and the Desert Saints covered the north and east. The road sentinels watched the emergency department. The Thunder Ridge MC monitored the staff parking structure. The Granite Suns and Western Guardians set up rotating observation posts at every ground floor window. Inside the hospital, Brick organized a 12-man rotation. Two brothers on the ICU floor at all times, dressed in street clothes, occupying the waiting room like worried relatives. Two more in the cafeteria on the second floor, with sight lines to the main corridor. Two in the lobby. The remaining six positioned at stairwells and service entrances that weren't covered by security cameras. Forge himself took the position Shelby had described, the one that mattered most. The supply closet adjacent to her ICU room, 6 feet from her door, hidden behind a rack of linens and medical supplies. He stood there each night from 10 p.m. until dawn, watching the hallway through a gap in the door, seeing every nurse, every doctor, every orderly who walked past. He told the ICU charge nurse, Ruth Ann, what they suspected. She hadn't believed it at first. Hospitals were sanctuaries. People didn't come to hospitals to kill patients. But Forge had looked at her with eyes that held no room for argument, and Ruth Ann had spent 32 years working nights in a building where people came to deal, and she understood that sanctuaries existed only as long as someone was willing to defend them. She implemented her own protocols. Every staff member entering the ICU floor had to badge in and be visually confirmed by the station nurse. No exceptions. Any unfamiliar face was to be challenged immediately and have their credentials verified before proceeding past the nurse's station. Detective Hargrove called Forge on the afternoon of day 5 with news that confirmed everything Shelby had predicted. "We identified the third shooter," Hargrove said. "Name's Desmond Kirsch, 42 years old, enforcer for the Iron Jaw MC out of Bakersfield. 3 priors, 2 of them violent. Warrants in California and Nevada. And NRC says Kirsch hasn't left the state. He's still here. And he knows exactly where the girl is. He's coming for her. That's what our intelligence suggests, yes. We've requested additional units for the hospital, but you're understaffed and overworked and can't post a 24-hour guard on a single witness." Hargrove was quiet for a moment. "That's accurate. We'll have patrol cars making regular passes, and I'm pushing for plainclothes in the building, but I can't guarantee anything." "You don't need to," Forge said. "We've got 260 men outside and a dozen inside." She laid out exactly how he's going to try it. "We'll be ready." "I can't officially sanction vigilante protection of a witness." "Then don't officially know about it." Hargrove sighed, the sigh of a man who understood that the law was a structure, not a guarantee, and that sometimes the space between what the system could provide and what a situation required was filled by people who didn't wait for authorization. "Just don't kill anyone." "That depends entirely on what he does when he gets here." Day 5 passed, night fell, the hospital dimmed to its nocturnal rhythm. Corridors that hummed with activity during the day went quiet. Fluorescent lights switched to their softer evening settings. The ICU floor settled into the hushed, watchful atmosphere of a place where sleep and death existed in uncomfortable proximity. Shelby slept. Her vitals held steady for the first time since the surgery. Heart rate normal, blood pressure stable. Oxygen saturation climbing back toward levels that didn't require supplemental support. Her body young and resilient despite the malnutrition that had compromised, it was rebuilding itself with a stubbornness that mirrored the personality inhabiting it. At 10 p.m., Forge took his position in the supply closet. Brick was in the waiting room at the end of the hall, reading a magazine. He wasn't actually reading. Sully was in the stairwell, sitting on the landing between floors 3 and 4, with his back against the wall and his eyes on the fire door. Boone was in the lobby, occupying an armchair near the information desk with a cup of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago. The ICU night shift consisted of Ruth Ann and 2 other nurses. They moved through their rounds with quiet efficiency, checking patients, adjusting medications, documenting vitals in the soft glow of computer monitors. Ruth Ann made a point of walking past Forge's closet every 30 minutes, giving him a slight nod that meant all clear. 11 p.m. passed, then 11:30. At 11:47, precisely 5 days and 0 minutes after the shooting at Whistler's Roadhouse, a figure in surgical scrubs walked through the ICU's secure entrance, using a badge that hospital security would later determine had been stolen from a resident's locker in the physician's changing room. The figure moved with the casual confidence of someone who belonged. Clipboard in hand, stethoscope draped around the neck, head slightly down, face partially obscured by a surgical cap pulled low over the forehead. The posture of a doctor making late rounds unremarkable and invisible, in the way that uniforms made people invisible. Ruth Ann was at her station. She looked up as the figure passed. Something registered in the back of her mind, some discordance between the way the man moved and the way the doctors she'd worked with for 3 decades moved. The gait was wrong, too deliberate, too aware of the hallway's geography. Doctors on late rounds moved with the distracted confidence of people thinking about the patient they were about to see. This man was thinking about the hallway itself, noting the cameras, measuring distances, reading the space the way a person reads a space when they're planning what's going to happen inside it. Ruth Ann reached for the phone. She pressed the button that connected to the security desk. The figure was already past her station, walking down the corridor towards Shelby's room with unhurried steps that ate the distance between intention and execution. 15 feet, 10, 5. His hand reached for the door handle, and Forge stepped out of the supply closet and pressed the barrel of a Colt 45 against the base of the man's skull. "Hello, Desmond," Forge said. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that carried more threat than any shout could. "We've been waiting for you." Desmond Kirsch froze. The clipboard hit the floor with a flat plastic clatter that echoed down the empty hallway. His hand, which had been closing around the door handle to Shelby's room, slowly opened and rose to shoulder height. "Don't move," Forge said. "Don't even breathe wrong." Down the hallway, Ruth Ann was already on the phone with security. Behind Forge, the stairwell door opened, and Sully appeared, moving fast and silent for a man his size. From the other end of the corridor, Brick emerged from the waiting room, his face set in an expression that suggested he was hoping Kirsch would give him a reason. Within 60 seconds, hospital security arrived. 2 guards who looked at the scene with the wide-eyed confusion of men encountering something well beyond their training. Then Brick and Sully were there, and Boone coming up from the lobby, and more brothers filtering in from their posts throughout the building, converging on the 4th-floor hallway like antibodies responding to an infection. "On your knees," Forge said. Kirsch dropped slowly, hands behind his head. He was 42 years old but looked older. Prison tattoos covered his neck in patterns that told stories of allegiance and violence. A scar ran from his left ear to his jawline, the same scar Shelby had described in the moments before she fell asleep. The scar that marked him. The scar that would convict him. Brick zip-tied Kirsch's wrist behind his back, while Sully patted him down with the methodical thoroughness of a man who'd done this before on both sides of the law. They found a 9mm in a shoulder holster strapped under the stolen scrubs, a serrated blade taped to his left ankle, and in the breast pocket of the surgical top, a syringe filled with something clear. Sully held up the syringe. "What's this?" Kirsch said nothing, stared straight ahead with eyes that held no emotion of any kind. Not fear, not anger, not even the resignation of a man caught in the act. Just the blank reptilian calm of someone who had stopped caring about outcomes a long time ago. Dr. Pemberton appeared from around the corner. She must have been working late, or perhaps she'd never left. She looked at the syringe in Sully's hand, and her expression shifted from confusion to horror in the space between heartbeats. "Potassium chloride," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Injected into an IV line, it causes immediate cardiac arrest. If nobody's watching the monitors at the moment of injection, it looks like the heart simply stopped. Natural causes. Nearly impossible to detect on a standard autopsy unless you are specifically testing for it." She looked at Kirsch. At this man kneeling on the floor of her ICU in stolen scrubs with a syringe designed to murder a 17-year-old girl in a way that would look like her damaged body had simply given up. "You were going to kill her," Dr. Pemberton said. Not a question. A statement delivered with a disgust that went deeper than professional outrage. "A child. In my hospital. In a bed where I spent 6 hours putting her back together." Kirsch smiled, a small, empty expression that never reached his eyes. Said nothing. Police arrived 11 minutes later, Detective Hargrove and 4 uniformed officers. They took custody of Kirsch, Mirandized him, walked him out in handcuffs. Bikers had lined the corridor between the ICU and the elevator, every man from every club standing shoulder to shoulder in silence as Kirsch passed. No threats, no shouting. Just the full weight of 7 chapters staring at a handcuffed killer with expressions that promise consequences the justice system might not deliver. Kershey kept his eyes forward, never looked at any of them. But Forge, who had spent 6 decades reading men the way Shelby read rooms, saw the tremor in his jaw, saw the sweat beating at his temples despite the hospital's aggressive air conditioning. Kirsch had walked in expecting to kill one sleeping girl and walk out clean. He'd walked into a fortress manned by men who'd been waiting for him. "How did you know?" Hargrove asked Forge once Kirsch was loaded into the patrol car in the parking lot below. They were standing by the hospital's ambulance bay, the night air cold enough to see their breath. "She told me," laid out exactly how he'd come. Night shift, stolen scrubs, clipboard, something in the IV, not a gun. Even predicted the timing, same time as the original shooting 11:47. Skeleton crew, easier to blend in. Hargrove looked at him. "She predicted all of that. Every detail. The kid reads danger the way you and I read a menu. 12 foster homes will do that to someone." Forge looked back at the hospital, at the windows of the 4th floor where Shelby was sleeping, unaware of how close death had come for the 2nd time in 5 days. "We've had a rotating watch inside and out since she told me. 12 guys in the building at all times. Another 30 in the lot. He never had a chance." Hargrove shook his head slowly. "You realize I can't officially condone any of this. And I realize you showed up 11 minutes after we caught him. If she'd been relying on official protection, she'd be dead." The silence that followed was uncomfortable for both of them, but for different reasons. Hargrove because he knew Forge was right. Forge because being right didn't make the terror of the last 5 days any less real. "There's something else," Hargrove said. His tone shifted, the kind of shift that preceded information nobody wanted to receive. "We've been working Kirsch since we ID'd him, running his connections, pulling phone records, tracing payments. The 3 shooters at Whistler's were contract hitters, hired and paid in advance." "By who?" "A man named Stryker, real name Warren Ekdahl, president of the Copperhead MC out of Ridgemont. He's been trying to take over Iron Wolf's territory for 2 years. Paid Kirsch and his crew $50,000 to take you out." Forge absorbed that, filed it alongside the other facts that had accumulated over 5 days of sitting in a plastic chair beside a hospital bed. Stryker, Copperhead MC, $50,000, a professional hit disguised as a bar shooting. "But that's not the worst of it," Hargrove continued. "Tell me." "Kirsch failing to finish the job tonight changes Stryker's calculus. The girl is the only witness who can identify Kirsch at the bar. The other 2 shooters are holding their tongues lawyered up, not talking. Without her testimony, the case weakens significantly." Hargrove paused. 2 hours ago, our CI reported that Stryker has put out a new contract. Not on you this time." Forge's chest tightened. He already knew what was coming. $100,000, Hargrove said, on the girl. The parking lot was quiet. 260 motorcycles sitting in their rose chrome dulled by the night. Men standing in small groups, some sleeping, some awake, and all of them unaware that the girl they had come to protect now had a 6-figure price on her head. "Can you arrest him?" Forge asked. His voice was controlled. The voice of a man who had spent decades keeping violence leashed behind a tone that revealed nothing. "Not yet. The CI's information is intelligence, not evidence. We need corroborating testimony, financial records, something that ties Stryker directly to the contracts. What Kirsch tells us in interrogation will matter, but enforcers like him tend to be remarkably silent when it comes to naming the people who pay them. So he's out there with 100,000 reasons to kill a 17-year-old girl, and you can't touch him." "Not yet," Hargrove repeated. "I'm working on it. These things take time." Time. The word landed like a stone in water. Shelby didn't have time. She was lying in a hospital bed with a healing wound in her chest and a price on her head, and the man who'd put it there was sitting in a clubhouse in Ridgemont, untouchable behind the gap between what the police knew and what they could prove. Forge went back inside, took the elevator to the 4th floor, walked past the nurse's station where Ruth Ann was writing her incident report with hands that still hadn't stopped shaking, pushed open the door to Shelby's room. She was awake, sitting up slightly, her eyes wide in the dim light. "I heard voices," she said. Her voice was stronger than it had been that morning, but it carried a tension that hadn't been there before. "In the hallway, what happened?" Forge sat in the chair. Took her hand the way he'd taken it every day for the last 5 days, wrapping his fingers around hers, feeling the pulse in her wrist that he'd come to monitor with the obsessive attention of a man who understood exactly how quickly it could stop. Kirsch came, just like you said he would. Same time. Scrubs, clipboard, got all the way to your door. Forge held her gaze. But we were waiting. Brick and Sully grabbed him. Police have him in custody. All 3 shooters are locked up now. Shelby didn't look relieved. She looked like someone doing math, running calculations behind her eyes that moved too fast to follow. What was he carrying? Forge hesitated. A gun, a knife, and a syringe. Potassium chloride. It wasn't a question. Forge stared at her. How did you know? It's what I would have used, Shelby said flatly, if I needed someone dead and needed it to look natural. IV access is already established. Potassium stops the heart. It metabolizes fast hard to detect postmortem unless you're looking for it specifically. I read about it in a true crime book at my 5th foster home. The family had a whole shelf of them. The matter-of-fact way she said it chilled Forge more than anything that had happened in the hallway. This girl thought about death the way other kids thought about homework. Not because she was morbid or damaged, but because understanding how people killed was a survival skill in a world that had never guaranteed her survival. There's more, Forge said. The police identified who hired the shooters. Shelby's eyes sharpened. Who? Man named Stryker, president of the Copperhead MC. He's been trying to take our territory for 2 years. Paid $50,000 for the hit on me. And now Forge didn't want to tell her. Wanted to shield her from this the way fathers were supposed to shield their children from the darkest parts of the world. But Shelby had never had the luxury of being shielded, and lying to her would be a betrayal worse than the truth. He's put a new contract out, $100,000. On you. Shelby's heart monitor spiked, a brief accelerometer that the machine recorded in peaks and valleys of green light. Then it settled. Forge watched her face and saw something remarkable happen. The fear arrived, lived in her eyes for 3 or 4 seconds, and then was processed, cataloged, and converted into something else entirely. She was thinking, not panicking, thinking. The police can't arrest him, she said. Not a question. Not enough evidence yet. The informant's word isn't sufficient for a warrant. So we need him to incriminate himself publicly in a way that can't be denied or walked back. Forge looked at her. This 17-year-old girl with a bullet wound in her chest and a $100,000 bounty on her head, lying in a hospital bed surrounded by machines that monitored every function of a body that had died once already, and she was strategizing. Not asking to be saved, not waiting for someone else to solve the problem. Working it the way she worked every problem that she'd ever faced with the cold, clear pragmatism of someone who had learned early that no one was coming to rescue her and that survival was a verb, not a noun. What are you thinking? Forge asked. How many bikers are in the parking lot right now? 260, 7 clubs. And how many does Stryker have? The Copperheads run about 15, maybe 20. Shelby was quiet for a moment. Her eyes moved to the window, to the darkness beyond the glass where the motorcycles sat in their rows. Then we don't need the law, she said slowly. We need witnesses, 260 of them, and a camera. Explain. Stryker put a contract on a 17-year-old girl. That's not something he can spin. That's not a territory dispute or a business decision. That's a grown man paying to have a kid murdered. If that becomes public, if he has to stand in front of every club in the region and own it, he loses everything. Reputation, alliances, the ability to operate. She turned back to Forge. Her eyes were clear and sharp despite the pain medication, despite the exhaustion, despite everything. We take all 260 bikes to his clubhouse. Not to fight, to witness. Bring the Channel 7 reporter, the one who did your interview. Bring the camera, and I'll talk to him myself. Absolutely not. You're not going anywhere near. He put a price on my head, Shelby said. Her voice was quiet, but carried a weight that stopped Forge mid-sentence. That makes this my fight. Not yours, not the club's, mine. And I'm not going to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering when the next Kirsch is coming through the next door. She squeezed his hand. You showed up for me every Thursday, $20 and a question about whether I was eating. You showed up, and that's why I'm alive. Now let me show up for myself. Let me finish this." Forge looked at her for a long time. At this girl who had nothing and had turned that nothing into a kind of armor, who read violence like language and threat like weather, and had survived 17 years of being unwanted by becoming the most capable person in every room she entered. "You'll have every brother from every club behind you," he said finally. "I know, that's the point. He needs to see them. He needs to understand what he's up against. Not guns or fists, but numbers. Witnesses. People who will remember what he says and what he does. Accountability." She leaned back against the pillows. The conversation had exhausted her. Pain was reasserting itself through the medication, tightening the skin around her eyes, pulling her mouth into a thin line. "Call the reporter," Shelby said. "Set it up. But not until I'm out of this bed. I'm not confronting anyone in a hospital gown." Despite everything, Forge almost smiled. The next morning, Colleen Ashford from Channel 7 arrived at the hospital. Not for an interview with Forge this time, but at his request to discuss something he described only as a story that's going to change everything you think you know about the biker world. Colleen was 38, a veteran journalist with a reputation for finding human stories in places most reporters wouldn't look. Her coverage of the vigil had already generated 3 million views and counting. The image of rival clubs filling a hospital parking lot had become one of those rare pieces of media that transcended its context and became a symbol. People who had never thought about motorcycle clubs, who had dismissed bikers as criminals and outlaws, saw that image and felt something shift in their understanding of what loyalty looked like. Forge briefed her in the hospital conference room, told her about Stryker, about the contract, about Shelby's plan. Colleen listened with the focused intensity of someone who understood that what she was hearing wasn't just a story. It was an event that hadn't happened yet. "She wants to confront him herself," Colleen asked. "She insists on it. She's 17. She's also the bravest person I've ever met, and I've known a lot of people who thought they were brave." Colleen was quiet for a moment. As soon as she's discharged, Dr. Pemberton says 5 to 7 days if recovery continues. I'll be there." On day 8, Dr. Pemberton cleared Shelby for discharge. "You're not healed," she warned. "You've got weeks of recovery ahead. Physical therapy twice a week. Follow-up appointments. No heavy lifting, no strenuous activity, no getting shot again." The last part was delivered with the dry humor of a doctor who had spent too many nights in this ICU and needed to find levity wherever it survived. "Promise me you'll take care of yourself." "I promise," Shelby said. Forge brought clothes, jeans that fit because he had asked Darla to guess her size. A soft flannel shirt that wouldn't press against the bandages still covering her left side, and the leather vest that had arrived 3 days earlier, hand-delivered by the presidents of all 7 clubs. Custom made, 7 patches on the back, one from each club that had stood vigil. And across the top, embroidered in silver thread, Shelby Calloway's sister to all. Shelby dressed slowly. Each movement was a negotiation with pain. Raising her left arm above her waist sent fire through her chest. Bending to pull on her shoes made her vision go gray at the edges. But she dressed, stood up, looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for the first time in 8 days. The face looking back was thinner than she remembered, sharper. The eyes were different too, older. The eyes of someone who had died and come back and understood what that meant in a way that couldn't be explained to anyone who hadn't made the trip. They wheeled her to the main entrance. Hospital policy. As the automatic doors opened, she heard it before she saw it. A rumble, deep and constant in building, vibrating through the floor and up through the wheelchair and into her bones. 260 motorcycles sat in perfect formation in the parking lot. Every biker stood beside their machine at attention. As Shelby appeared in the wheelchair, every engine started simultaneously. The sound was beyond anything she had words for. A thunder that shook the glass doors behind her and rattled in her damaged chest and moved through her body like a second heartbeat. Not aggressive, not threatening. A salute, a promise, a declaration that said, "You are seen, you are valued, you are ours." Shelby couldn't breathe, not from her injuries, from the weight of being wanted by people who didn't know her name 8 days ago and now considered her family. Forge helped her stand from the wheelchair, supported her weight as they walked to his bike, a Harley-Davidson Street Glide black and chrome, the president's patch on the back of his vest catching the morning light. He got her settled on the back seat, careful of her left side, making sure the vest's patches lay flat against her back. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded. She couldn't speak. Forge started the engine. Shelby wrapped her good arm around his waist, gripping the leather, feeling the vibration of the machine beneath them, and the warmth of the man in front of her, and the vast, improbable reality of every club in the region preparing to follow them wherever they went. They pulled out of the parking lot. The formation followed. A river of chrome and leather, and engine noise flowing through city streets. People on sidewalks stopped to stare. Cars pulled over. Someone on a corner held up a phone filming. Others just watched, frozen by the sight of something they couldn't explain, but understood instinctively was important. They rode to Forge's house, a ranch-style home on a quiet street at the edge of town. Clapboard siding painted gray, a garage out back, trees in the yard going bare with November, a porch with a rocking chair that no one had sat in for 3 years. The other clubs peeled away as they went heading back to their territories, their clubhouses, their lives. But every president raised a fist as they passed Forge's bike. A salute, an acknowledgement, a promise that when the time came when Shelby was ready to face Stryker, they would be there. Forge helped her off the bike and into the house. The living room was clean, leather couch, television, a bookshelf with more photographs than books. On the wall, a framed picture of a young man who looked like a younger version of Forge. Same jawline, same gray eyes, but softer. Unfinished in the way that people who die young always look in photographs, frozen in a version of themselves that never got the chance to harden into whoever they would have become. Dylan, the son who died 3 years ago. "Your room is down the hall," Forge said. "Second door on the right." Shelby walked slowly. Each step was a small victory against the pain and the fatigue and the accumulated weight of 8 days that had changed the fundamental architecture of her life. She pushed open the door. The room was simple and perfect. Fresh paint on the walls, a pale blue that reminded her of early morning sky. A real bed with clean sheets and an actual comforter, thick and soft, the kind she'd seen in store windows and never touched. A desk by the window. A closet with a door that closed. A window that looked out over the backyard where brown grass and bare trees waited for a spring they trusted was coming. On the desk, 2 envelopes. The first one she recognized. Her envelope. The one with $1,847 that had been hidden under the spare tire in the Honda. Someone had retrieved it, kept it safe, placed it here for her. Next to it, a second envelope. Inside, a bank statement showing $61,000 in an account bearing her name. On the bed, the vest. She'd been wearing it, but now she took it off and held it at arm's length. Looked at the 7 patches. Traced the embroidered letters of her name with a fingertip. "You earned it," Forge said from the doorway. "Every patch, every brother, every bit of it." Shelby turned, vest in her hands, tears on her face. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "I've never had a family. I don't know how to be someone's daughter." "You just be you," Forge said. "That's all I'm asking. Just be the girl who showed up when it mattered." That night, Shelby slept in a real bed for the first time in 8 months. In a real house with a real family just down the hall. The sheets smelled like laundry detergent, a clean chemical scent that was somehow the most beautiful thing she'd ever smelled, because it meant someone had washed them for her, had prepared this room, had thought about what she might need and provided it without being asked. She fell asleep quickly. The exhaustion of 8 days in a hospital, of healing from a gunshot wound, of dying and coming back, of processing the impossible shift from invisible to seen, pulled her under like a current she couldn't resist. At 3:47 in the morning, she woke screaming. The nightmare was total. Not a dream, but a reliving. The gun rising, the 7 steps, the bullet entering her chest with a force that felt like being struck by a car, the cold linoleum against her cheek, the taste of copper, the bubbling in her lungs, the darkness pulling her down, and Forge's face streaked with tears, his mouth moving with words she couldn't hear, growing smaller and dimmer as she sank towards something that had no name and no bottom. She couldn't breathe, couldn't separate the dream from the room. Her chest felt like it was being crushed. Her heart hammered against her ribs with a violence that made the healing wound scream in protest. The door burst open. Forge filled the frame backlit by the hallway light. He crossed the room in 3 strides and sat on the edge of the bed. You're okay. You're safe. You're home. But Shelby couldn't hear him past the roaring in her ears. Couldn't see past the gun that was still rising in her mind, that would always be rising, replaying on a loop that her brain refused to stop. Shelby, Forge took her face in his hands, forced her to look at him. Look at me, you're having a panic attack. You need to breathe with me. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Come on, kid, breathe with me. She tried, failed, tried again. The room lurched and steadied. The gun faded. Forge's face replaced it, solid and real, and there. Slowly, breath by breath, the panic receded. Reality reassembled itself around her. The blue walls, the clean sheets, the window with its view of the bare backyard. The man sitting on her bed with his hands on her shoulders and his eyes holding her gaze with an intensity that said, I'm not going anywhere. You've been through hell, Forge said when her breathing had stabilized. This is what happens after. Dr. Pemberton warned us. PTSD nightmares. Flashbacks. They're going to come for a while. I thought I was dying again. But you're not. You're here. You're alive. You're safe. Shelby's hands were still shaking. She pressed them flat against the comforter, feeling the texture of the fabric grounding herself in the physical reality of a bed that belonged to her, in a room that belonged to her, in a house where someone would come running if she screamed. What if I can't do this, she whispered. What if I can't be normal again? Forge was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that cut through the residual fog of the nightmare and brought her fully back into the present. Tomorrow we finish it. Your plan, your call. But tonight you need to rest. And I need you to know something. He leaned forward. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever Stryker says or does, you don't have to face it alone. You design the plan, you make the calls, but I'll be right beside you. 260 brothers will be right behind you. Shelby looked at him, at this man who had walked into a bar and asked a starving girl if she was eating, who had called her daughter while she bled on his chest, who had stood guard in a supply closet for 5 nights because she'd told him the killer was coming and he'd believed her. Okay, she said. Okay. Forge stood, walked to the door, paused. Get some sleep, kid. Tomorrow you end this. He closed the door. Shelby lay in the dark, listening to his footsteps recede down the hallway, listening to the house settle around her with the small sounds that houses make when they're being lived in. Creaking floorboards, the furnace cycling on, wind against the windows. She thought about Stryker in his clubhouse in Ridgemont, about the $100,000 contract that had her name attached to it, about the phone calls and the text messages spreading through the criminal network, carrying her description, her location, the price of her death. Then she thought about 260 motorcycles, about 7 patches on a leather vest, about a man who'd called her daughter and meant it. She closed her eyes. And for the first time since the bullet entered her chest, Shelby Calloway felt something she hadn't felt in 17 years. Not just safe, not just wanted, ready. They mobilized at 4:47 in the morning. Shelby stood on Forge's front porch in the dark wearing the leather vest with 7 patches, watching the street fill with motorcycles. They came in waves. First the Iron Wolves, 23 bikes rolling up to the curb with engines throttled low, out of respect for neighbors who were still sleeping and had no idea that the quiet ranch house at the end of their block had become the staging ground for something that hadn't happened in the history of outlaw motorcycle culture. Then the Reapers arriving from the east. Hawk at the front of his formation, silver beard, catching the glow of a streetlight as he killed his engine and nodded once at Forge, who was standing beside Shelby on the porch steps. Then the Desert Saints from the South Preacher, leading 35 bikes in a column so precise it looked like a military convoy. The Rhodes Sentinels, the Thunder Ridge MC, the Granite Sons, the Western Guardians. By 5:15, 260 motorcycles lined Forge's street and spilled around the corner onto Meridian Avenue. The sound of that many engines idling at once was something Shelby felt more than heard. A vibration that traveled through the concrete porch steps and up through her boots and into the healing wound in her chest where it settled like a second pulse. Colleen Ashford arrived last. Not on a motorcycle, but in a dark sedan with her cameraman, a quiet man named Dwight, who had filmed war zones for the Associated Press before settling into local news. They parked at the end of the block, and Colleen walked up the driveway with her camera bag over one shoulder and the expression of a journalist who understood she was about to document something that would define the rest of her career. "You sure about this?" she asked Shelby. "No," Shelby said, "but I'm doing it anyway." Colleen studied her for a moment, took in the vest, the bandages visible beneath the flannel shirt, the careful way she held her left arm against her body to minimize the pain that every movement produced, took in the eyes, which were 17 years old and 1,000 years old at the same time. "Then let's go," Colleen said. Forge helped Shelby onto the back of his bike. The motion pulled at her chest and she had to clamp her jaw shut to keep from making a sound. The stitches beneath her bandages protested every shift of her torso. Dr. Pemberton had been explicit in her discharge instructions. No strenuous activity, no heavy lifting, no motorcycle rides to confront the president of a rival club who had placed a $100,000 bounty on your head. Shelby had decided that medical advice, like most rules she'd encountered in her life, was a suggestion that applied to people whose circumstances permitted compliance. She wrapped her good arm around Forge's waist, gripped the leather of his vest, felt the engine come alive beneath her with a rumble that traveled through her bones and momentarily overwhelmed the pain. "Ready?" Forge asked over his shoulder. "Go." They pulled away from the house. Behind them, the full strength of 7 clubs followed. The ride through pre-dawn streets felt like moving through a dream. Streetlights casting amber pools on empty asphalt. Closed storefronts reflecting the headlights of the formation in their darkened windows. The occasional car pulling to the curb to let the column pass, drivers staring through their windshields at the impossible procession with expressions that ranged from confusion to awe. At the first major intersection, the Reapers joined the main formation, 40 bikes merging with fluid precision. At the second, the Desert Saints folded in from a side street. By the time they reached the industrial district on the eastern edge of the city, where warehouses and machine shops lined roads built for truck traffic, they were 260 strong. A river of chrome and leather and controlled fury flowing through the gray morning toward a destination that most of them had seen only from the outside and under very different circumstances. The Copperhead MC Clubhouse was a converted warehouse at the end of Greer Road. Steel siding painted flat black, security cameras mounted on every corner. Bars on the windows, though, the windows themselves were small and placed high, more ventilation than view. A chain-link fence surrounded the property topped with razor wire that caught the first pale light of dawn and held it in sharp, bright points. Forge had been here once before, years ago when Stryker was new to the presidency, and there had been talk of establishing territorial boundaries through negotiation rather than violence. That conversation had ended badly. Most conversations with Stryker ended badly. The man operated on a frequency that processed diplomacy as weakness and compromise as defeat. 260 motorcycles surrounded the building. They filled the parking lot first, then the street, then the lots of adjacent businesses that wouldn't open for hours. Engines idling, headlights pointed at the steel front door. The combined sound of that many machines was a physical force, a vibration that rattled the security cameras on their mounts and shook dust from the warehouse's corrugated roof. Forge killed his engine. The presidents of the other 6 clubs did the same. One by one, like lights being extinguished, the engines fell silent. 260 at once, then 100, then 50, then 10, then silence. The silence was worse than the sound, more threatening, more final. The sound had been a warning. The silence was a verdict. The steel door opened. Stryker stepped out. Warren Ekdahl, 58 years old, president of the Copperhead MC for the last 11 years, tall and lean in the way that certain men become lean when they burn through calories with the constant metabolic expense of rage. Shaved head, goatee trimmed close, tattoos covering his neck and both arms in patterns that depicted serpents and blades and skulls with fangs. The iconography of a life dedicated to the proposition that fear was the only currency worth accumulating. He stood in the doorway and looked at what was waiting for him. Shelby watched his face from 30 feet away and saw what she needed to see. A flicker, brief, controlled, immediately suppressed but present. The involuntary contraction of muscles around the eyes that occurs when the brain processes information it doesn't want to accept. Fear. Stryker was afraid. Behind him, 15 Copperhead members filed out. They arranged themselves in a line at their president's back, and Shelby could read each of them the way she'd read the 3 men who walked into Whistler's 9 days ago. Some were steady, most were not. They shifted their weight, glanced at each other, did the arithmetic that men do when confronted with overwhelming numbers, and arrived at the same answer. 17-1. No version of this ended well for the Copperheads, and everyone standing in that parking lot knew it. Forge dismounted, helped Shelby off the bike. The pain of swinging her leg over the seat and finding her footing on the asphalt nearly buckled her knees, but she locked them, stood straight, kept her face neutral the way she'd always kept it when adults were watching, and weakness was an invitation. They walked toward Stryker. Every step sent pain radiating through Shelby's left side like fault lines, spreading from an epicenter. She felt each one of her stitches individually, felt the healing tissue stretching and protesting and threatening to tear. But she kept walking because this was her plan and her fight, and she would not let the body that had already survived a bullet and 47 seconds of death prevent her from finishing what she'd started. Behind them, the presidents followed. Brick and Hawk, Preacher, and the others. A wall of leather and authority moving in formation across the cracked asphalt. To the side, barely visible in the gray light, Colleen and Dwight had positioned themselves with the camera already rolling. The red light was on. Everything that happened in the next few minutes would exist forever. Stryker watched them approach. His jaw was set. His hands hung at his sides with studied casualness. But Shelby noticed the tendons standing out along his forearms. Tension held in the muscles controlled, but present the way a coiled spring holds energy. "You've got some nerve," Stryker said, when they were close enough to hear him without raising voices. "Rolling up on my house." Forge started to speak, but Shelby stepped forward, in front of Forge, between the president of the Iron Wolves and the president of the Copperheads, between the man who had adopted her and the man who had tried to kill her. A 17-year-old girl in a leather vest with 7 patches standing in the space where violence was supposed to happen, filling it with something else instead. "You put a contract on me," Shelby said. Her voice was quiet, steady, carried only by the silence of every man assembled, a silence so total that her words needed no volume to reach the farthest row of motorcycles. It was not the voice of someone making an accusation. It was the voice of someone stating a fact the way you'd state that the sun rises in the east or that water runs downhill. Simple, undeniable, stripped of everything except the truth at its center. Stryker looked at her, actually looked at her perhaps for the first time, saw the bandages beneath the flannel, saw the careful way she held her left arm, saw the dark crescents under her eyes that spoke of pain and sleepless nights, and the kind of exhaustion that came from surviving things that should have killed you. "You're the dishwasher," he said, "the one everyone's talking about." "Yeah." "You really threw yourself in front of a bullet for this old man." "Yeah." Why, the question hung in the November air. Shelby felt the weight of it, felt the presence of every rider behind her waiting, felt Forge behind her close enough to touch, but not touching, giving her the space to be the person she'd become in the 9 days since she'd run 7 steps across a barroom floor. "Because he showed up," Shelby said. She let the words sit, let them find their own weight in the silence. "Every Thursday for 6 months, same booth, same burger, same $20 tip. He asked me one question every week. 'Are you eating today, kid?' That's all. No lectures, no pity, no trying to fix me. He just showed up and asked if I was eating." She took a breath. It hurt. Everything hurt. But the words were coming, and they were hers, and she was going to say them all. "I was 17, living in my car, working for $7.25 an hour. I had no family, no address, no one who would notice if I disappeared. I was invisible, and he made me visible. $20 at a time, one question at a time. He showed up, and that was everything." She looked at Stryker with eyes that held no anger, no fear, only the brutal, unadorned clarity of someone who had been stripped down to the bedrock of who they were and found something there that couldn't be broken. "And you put $100,000 on my head because I cost you money, because I embarrassed you, because a 17-year-old girl who sleeps in a car and washes dishes for a living made you look weak in front of people whose opinions you need." She paused. Let the camera record the silence. Let Stryker feel the gaze of every man at his back and 15 of his own behind him, watching their president be addressed by a child with a hole in her chest and more courage than anyone in the parking lot had ever seen. "I'm 17 years old," Shelby said. "I weigh 112 pounds. I own a car that doesn't always start and an envelope with $1,800 in it. And you're afraid of me." She tilted her head slightly. "What does that tell you about who you've become?" Stryker's face didn't change, but something behind it did. Some tectonic movement in the substrata of his composure deep enough that only someone who'd spent her life reading the invisible architecture of human violence would have noticed. His eyes stayed on hers, but shifted in quality. The predatory focus softened into something older and less certain. No one spoke. The parking lot was still. 260 men standing beside their motorcycles, barely breathing, watching a girl dismantle a man's armor with nothing but the truth. Hawk stepped forward from behind Shelby. "7 clubs," he said. His voice was gravel. 260 brothers, enemies who rode through the night and stood together for a week because of what this girl did. You've got 15. "Do the math," Preacher added from Hawk's right. The old man's voice carried the weight of 40 years in the life and the moral authority of someone who'd eulogized more bikers than most people had ever met. Stryker's jaw worked. He looked past Shelby to the formation behind her. "Read the patches: Iron Wolves, Reapers, Desert Saints, Road Sentinels, Thunder Ridge, Granite Suns, Western Guardians, clubs that had been at war with each other, with him, with themselves, all standing in unified stillness, with an intent that required no verbal articulation. "We're not here to start anything," Preacher said. His tone was calm in the way that deep water is calm. "We're asking you to do the right thing. Withdraw the contract. Leave the girl alone. Walk away from the territory war. Everybody goes home." "And if I refuse," Stryker said, but the defiance in his voice was mechanical, a reflex, the kind of resistance that men offer when they know the outcome is already decided but need to perform the ritual of opposition to preserve whatever remains of their dignity. "Then we stop asking nicely," Brick said from behind Shelby's left shoulder. The silence stretched again, longer this time. Shelby could hear the distant sound of traffic on the highway a mile east, the faint hum of the warehouse's ventilation system, the creak of leather as the assembled riders shifted their weight in the cold. Stryker looked at Shelby again. Really looked. Not at the vest or the bandages or the bikers behind her. At her face. At the eyes that held his without flinching. At the mouth that had spoken truth without raising its voice. At the girl who stood 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 112 pounds and had somehow generated enough gravitational force to pull 7 rival clubs into the same orbit. "You really are just a kid," he said, and something in his voice had changed. Some frequency that hadn't been there before. Lower, rougher, eroded by something that was working its way to the surface. The surface against his will. "Yeah," Shelby said, "I really am." Stryker was quiet for a long time, the longest silence of the morning. When he spoke again, he wasn't looking at anyone. His eyes had drifted to some middle distance beyond the parking lot, beyond the fences, in the warehouse, and the assembled army of his enemies. Looking at something only he could see. "I was 15, he said. The words came out rough, unpracticed, the voice of a man unaccustomed to saying things that mattered. Living under a bridge outside of Reno. Hadn't eaten in 3 days. Stealing from gas stations to survive. No family, no prospects, nothing ahead of me except more of what was already behind me." He paused, drew a breath that shuddered slightly at its deepest point. "Old biker named Grady found me sleeping behind his garage. Big man, Grady Dunlop. Rode a panhead that he'd rebuilt 3 times and still swore was the best machine ever made. He didn't call the cops. Didn't call social services. He gave me a job sweeping floors, paid me in cash, and fed me dinner every night at his kitchen table. Taught me how to rebuild a carburetor, how to true a wheel, how to read a torque wrench, and how to read people, which was harder." Stryker's voice was losing its armor. Word by word, the enforced flatness that had characterized his speech since he stepped out of the clubhouse was giving way to something underneath. Something that had been locked behind decades of the particular hardness that men in the outlaw world cultivated. the way gardeners cultivated thorns. Grady saved my life. Plain and simple. I was 15 and dying by inches, and he showed up. Gave me a purpose. Gave me a family. When he got sick 10 years later, I paid his medical bills. Sat with him in the hospital every day for 6 weeks. Held his hand when he died because he'd held mine when I was a kid with nothing. And that's what you do for people who show up. He looked at Shelby, and she saw it. The thing she'd been looking for. Not surrender, not defeat, recognition. The shock of seeing yourself reflected in someone you've been trying to destroy and understanding in a single devastating instant what that means about who you've become. Grady would have been ashamed of me, Stryker said. His voice broke on the name. A hairline fracture that spread through the sentence and left it in pieces on the cold asphalt between them. Putting money on a kid's head, sending men to do what I was too cowardly to do myself. A kid who did exactly what Grady did for me. Showed up for someone, put herself between danger and somebody else. He shook his head. Slow, heavy movements, the kind a man makes when the weight of his own history becomes temporarily unbearable. He took me off the street when I was nothing, fed me when I was hungry, gave me a life when I didn't have one. And I looked at you and saw exactly the same story, and instead of recognizing it, I tried to end it. Because you embarrassed me. Because you cost me money. He was quiet again. Shelby didn't speak. Didn't need to. The silence was doing work that words couldn't, filling the space between them with something that felt like the air before rain, heavy with what was coming, inevitable. The contract's withdrawn, Stryker said. He said it to Shelby, but his voice carried across the parking lot the way voices carry in open spaces when there's no wind and every surface is hard. 260 men heard it. 15 Copperhead members heard it. Colleen's camera recorded it. The words existed now in a form that couldn't be retracted or reinterpreted. I'll put the word out within the hour. Nobody touches the girl. And the territory war is done. Your borders are your borders. We stay on our side. Forge stepped forward. Just like that. Just like that. Stryker's eyes hadn't left Shelby's. That kid did something most of us only talk about. Lived the code. Real brotherhood. No patches required. I put a price on her head because I was embarrassed because she made me look weak. But killing her for that. He shook his head again. Grady didn't save me so I could become the kind of man who murders children. He turned to his crew. We're done here. Stand down. The Copperhead members filed back through the steel door, slowly with the uncertain posture of men who had braced for war and were now processing peace. Stryker was the last. He paused at the threshold, one hand on the door frame, and looked back at Shelby. You're a lucky kid, he said. You found something most of us spend our whole lives looking for and never get close to. His voice was stripped bare. No menace, no performance. Just an old man talking to a young girl about the thing that mattered most. Don't waste it. Then he stepped inside. The door closed, and the parking lot erupted. Not in violence, in release. 260 men who had ridden through the darkness, prepared for a confrontation that could have turned into a massacre, and instead watched a 17-year-old girl end a 2-year territory war with her voice in the truth and the unbearable weight of being right. Engines roared to life. Men cheered. Someone from the Granite Sons was actually crying and not trying to hide it. Hawk walked over to Forge and clapped him on the back, so hard it staggered the bigger man. Your kid just ended a war without throwing a punch, Hawk said. That's got to be some kind of record. That's my daughter, Forge said. His voice was thick and his eyes were wet, and he didn't care who saw it. She changes everything she touches. Shelby stood in the middle of it all. The noise, the celebration, the engines, the voices. 260 people who had come here ready to fight and were leaving in peace because she had stood in the space where violence was supposed to happen and filled it with something stronger. Her chest was screaming. The ride, the standing, the adrenaline, and its aftermath were all conspiring to remind her that she was 9 days post-surgery and had no business being on her feet. But she remained standing because the moment required it and because she had spent 17 years learning to endure. They rode back as the sun rose. The formation moving through streets that were beginning to wake up with the first stirrings of morning commuters and delivery trucks and people walking dogs who stopped on sidewalks to stare at the procession streaming past in the golden early light. The other clubs peeled off, so they went, heading home, heading back to their clubhouses and their territories and the lives that had been interrupted by a girl and a bullet and the impossible thing that happened after. But every president raised a fist as they separated from the formation. Every one of them looked at Forge's bike and the small figure on the back and understood that what they had witnessed that morning was not the end of something, but the beginning. Back at Forge's house, off the bike, into the kitchen where Brick had materialized from somewhere and was brewing coffee strong enough to strip varnish. Sully was at the table eating toast. Boone was leaning against the counter, cleaning his nails with a pocket knife, as though the last 2 hours had been a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning. "Sit," Forge said to Shelby, pulling out a chair. She sat. Every joint in her body thanked her for it. Forge set a plate in front of her: eggs, bacon, toast with butter, a glass of orange juice, food that someone had prepared while she was confronting the man who tried to have her killed. Food that was waiting for her when she came home, because that's what family did. They fed you. They made sure the table was set when you walked through the door. "So what now?" Brick asked. He was looking at Shelby, not Forge. They all were. Because somewhere in the last 9 days, the center of gravity had shifted, and everyone in the room understood who it had shifted to. "I need to finish my GED, Shelby said. She was eating the eggs with the focused attention of someone who had spent months rationing every calorie. Then community college. Forge mentioned something about culinary school. "You want to cook?" Sully asked. "I want to create something. Instead of just surviving, I want to build a place where people feel welcome, where nobody's invisible, where you can walk in hungry and walk out fed, even if you can't pay for it." She looked down at her plate, at the simple, perfect meal that had been made for her by people who cared whether she ate. "I want to do for someone else what Forge did for me," she said quietly. "Just show up. That's all." The kitchen was silent for a moment. Then Forge, who had his back to the room because he was doing something unnecessary at the stove to disguise the fact that he was crying, said without turning around, "We'll make it happen, whatever you need." Over the next 3 weeks, Shelby healed. The chest pain faded from constant to intermittent to occasional. The stitches came out. The wound began its slow transformation from raw, angry red to the puckered pink of new scar tissue. She started physical therapy at a clinic on Franklin Street, working with a therapist named Devereaux, who pushed her hard because he recognized in her the particular stubbornness of a person who would rather hurt than be limited. The nightmares came less frequently. Once a night, then every other night, then twice a week. Forge was there every time, sitting on the edge of her bed, talking her through the breathing, anchoring her to the present when her brain tried to drag her back to the barroom floor. She studied for her GED at the desk in her room in the pale blue room with the clean sheets in the window overlooking the yard where autumn was giving way to winter. The Iron Wolves had pooled their money to buy her textbooks and a laptop. Preacher, who had a master's degree in American literature that he never discussed, and that surprised everyone who learned about it, came by twice a week to help her with the essay section. The donation fund continued to grow. $83,000, then $90,000, then $112,000, as the story continued to circulate through the vast interconnected architecture of American sympathy. Shelby couldn't comprehend the number, couldn't reconcile it with the $1,847 that had represented the totality of her ambition 8 months ago. "Because you reminded them that good people exist," Forge told her when she asked why strangers kept sending money. "In a world that feels broken, you showed them it's not." On day 21, Shelby passed her GED exam, all 5 sections, the highest score in her testing cohort. Forge threw a party. Every club showed up. The house overflowed with leather vests and laughter and the smell of barbecue that Boone was smoking in the backyard with equipment borrowed from a granite son who owned a restaurant supply company. Hawk brought expensive bourbon. Preacher brought a first-edition copy of East of Eden, which he inscribed with the passage about Timshel, the idea that thou mayest choose your own path, and handed it to Shelby with the quiet ceremony of a man bestowing a blessing. At midnight, Forge led Shelby to the garage. Inside, covered by a paint-spattered tarp, was something that hadn't been there that morning. "What's this?" Shelby asked. "Your graduation present." He pulled the tarp. Beneath it was a Harley-Davidson Street 500, black and chrome, beginner-friendly but serious. Beautiful in the way that machines built for speed and freedom are always beautiful even standing still. On the gas tank custom painted in silver leaf were 7 symbols, one for each club that had stood vigil. Shelby ran her fingers across the paint, felt the cool metal beneath her fingertips. Her own bike, her own machine, her own freedom. After 17 years of moving through the world on terms dictated by foster parents and social workers and the grinding mechanics of poverty, she had something that would carry her wherever she decided to go. "I can't accept this," she whispered. "You can and you will, because you're a sister now. Sisters ride together." She looked at him, at this man who had walked into a bar and asked a starving girl if she was eating, who had called her daughter on a blood-soaked floor, who had stood in a supply closet for 5 nights and on a rival's doorstep at dawn and at the edge of her bed during every nightmare that followed, and who was now standing in a garage with engine oil on his hands and tears he wasn't bothering to hide, giving her the keys to a motorcycle, because he believed she deserved the wind in her hair and the open road ahead and the knowledge that she could outrun anything the world sent after her. "Thank you," Shelby said. Her voice broke on the second word. "For all of it, for showing up, for calling me your daughter, for giving me a family." Forge pulled her into a hug, careful of her healing side, strong enough that she could feel the certainty in it. "You gave me a family too, kid. You gave me a reason to be better than I was. You reminded me what matters." In the weeks that followed, Shelby learned to ride. Brick was her instructor, which surprised everyone because Brick communicated primarily through grunts and monosyllables and had never been accused of patience. But something about teaching Shelby brought out a gentleness in him that his brothers would have teased him about mercilessly if they hadn't been watching with the same expression he wore. Pride mixed with a tenderness that men in the outlaw world rarely permitted themselves to feel and even more rarely displayed. They started in Forge's driveway. Clutch control, balance at low speeds, the particular relationship between throttle and friction zone that determined whether you moved forward smoothly or stalled out and put your boot down in embarrassment. Shelby dropped the bike twice on the first day. Got back on both times without complaint, though the second drop sent a spike of pain through her healing chest that made her vision swim. "You okay?" Brick asked. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're white as a sheet." "I'm fine and I'm not stopping." Brick looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded and said nothing else because he recognized in her the same quality that had made her run 7 steps across a barroom floor. A stubbornness that transcended physical limitation. A refusal to be defined by what hurt. By the end of the second week, she was riding loops around the block. By the end of the third, she was taking the bike on surface streets, Brick riding beside her on his own machine, watching her mirrors and her lane position, and the way she leaned into turns that told him she was developing instincts faster than most riders he'd trained. Sully shouted unhelpful advice from the porch every time they passed the house. Boone filmed her progress on his phone and sent the clips to a group chat that included all 7 club presidents. Hawk responded to one particularly smooth cornering video with a single word: natural. Forge watched it all from the living room window, coffee in hand. Not interfering, not teaching, just watching his daughter learn to fly. 6 months later, Shelby enrolled in culinary school. The Iron Wolves paid her tuition. The Reapers found her an apartment near campus, though she spent most weekends at Forge's house cooking elaborate meals in his kitchen while he sat at the table pretending to read the newspaper and actually watching her with an expression that combined pride and wonder in the particular complicated joy of a man who had been given a second chance at fatherhood and was determined not to waste it. The Desert Saints bought her professional kitchen equipment, a full set of knives, a stand mixer, pots and pans that cost more than a month's rent at Whistler's Roadhouse. The Road Sentinels, Thunder Ridge Granite Sons, and Western Guardians all contributed to a fund for whatever she wanted to build when school was finished. Shelby threw herself into the work with the same intensity she brought to everything. She was the first student in the kitchen every morning and the last to leave every night. Her instructors noted her precision, her palate, her instinct for flavors that shouldn't work together but did. But what set her apart, what made her professors remember her name long after the semester ended, was the way she cooked for people. Not at them, for them. Every plate she sent out carried an attention and a care that went beyond technique into something closer to communion. She had learned in a Honda Civic, in a dish pit, in a hospital bed, that food was never just food. It was proof that someone gave a damn whether you survived the night. 1 year after the shooting, Shelby stood in an empty storefront on Clarkwell Street downtown. It needed everything. New kitchen, new floors, new plumbing, new wiring, new walls. The ceiling was stained from a decade of water damage, and the previous tenant had left behind nothing useful except a conviction that the space had good bones. "This is it," she said to Forge. "This is where I want to build it." "Then let's build it." They did, 7 clubs working together. Bikers who had spent their adult lives fighting each other, now standing side by side in a gutted storefront, running electrical conduit and hanging drywall, and tiling a kitchen floor for a girl who had reminded them that the things they'd been fighting about were smaller than the things they'd been fighting for. Hawk turned out to be skilled with tile work. Preacher did all the painting slow and meticulous, the same way he did everything. Brick installed the commercial range and nearly electrocuted himself twice, which Sully documented on his phone for posterity. Boone built the bar top from reclaimed oak sanding, each board by hand, until the grain glowed under varnish. The renovation took 4 months. 4 months of sawdust and paint fumes and the sound of power tools echoing off bare concrete. 4 months of men who carried weapons and wore patches that marked them as outlaws, standing on ladders with paintbrushes and arguing about grout color and whether the kitchen layout optimized workflow the way Shelby wanted it to. She was there every day, drawing plans on butcher paper, measuring and remeasuring, tasting test recipes in Forge's kitchen, and bringing in samples to the work crew for feedback. The bikers turned out to be surprisingly opinionated food critics. Hawk declared her pot roast the best thing he'd eaten since his grandmother died. Preacher suggested adding cornbread to the menu and provided his mother's recipe handwritten on a yellowed index card that he produced from his wallet with the reverence of a man presenting a sacred text. The restaurant opened 18 months after the shooting at Whistler's Roadhouse. Shelby named it Whistler's Second Chance. The menu featured comfort food made with intention. Burgers that tasted like someone who loved you had cooked them. Mashed potatoes that existed in a moral universe where calories were irrelevant and butter was a fundamental right. Pie that made grown men close their eyes and remember kitchens they hadn't stood in since childhood. The prices were reasonable, and on the door, hand-painted in letters that Shelby had stenciled herself, was a policy. Nobody eats alone. If you're hungry and can't pay, we'll feed you anyway. On opening night, 260 bikers showed up, 7 clubs filling every table, every booth, every available inch of standing room. They ate and they drank and they told stories that grew louder and less accurate as the evening progressed. Hawk and Preacher argued about which of them had done more work on the renovation. Brick tried to take credit for the electrical, which Sully disputed with photographic evidence of the near electrocution incidents. Boone sat at the bar he'd built with his own hands and drank bourbon and smiled the quiet smile of a man who understood that his best work would outlast him. Forge sat at the head table, the seat Shelby had reserved for him marked with a small brass plate that read Dad. He didn't speak, just sat there with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, looking through the kitchen window at his daughter. At this girl who had walked into his life as a starving dishwasher with nothing to her name and no reason to believe the world would offer her anything except more of what it had already given her. This girl who had run 7 steps across a barroom floor and changed the trajectory of everything she touched. She was in her element, moving through the kitchen with the fluid efficiency of someone who had found the thing they were made to do, calling orders, plating food with a precision that bordered on art, tasting sauces, adjusting seasoning, creating, building, transforming raw ingredients into something that nourished the body and the soul, and the ancient human need to sit at a table with other people and share a meal. At one point during the dinner rush, Shelby paused, looked up from the line. Through the window that separated the kitchen from the dining room, she could see them, all of them. The bikers in their vests, Forge at his table, the families and couples and solitary diners who had come because they had heard the story and wanted to see for themselves. The elderly man in the corner booth who had come in alone and was now eating a burger with tears on his face because nobody had asked him to eat with them in months. And Shelby had walked over and sat down across from him and said the words she'd learned from a biker in a roadhouse 6 months before everything changed. "You eating today?" 2 words, The simplest question in the world, and the most important one. Shelby Calloway had walked into Whistler's Roadhouse as a 17-year-old dishwasher with $1,847 to her name and nowhere to go. She had thrown herself in front of a bullet without thinking. And in those 7 steps between a dish pit and a corner booth, she had changed everything. She had found a father, 260 brothers and sisters, a future worth fighting for, a purpose that went beyond survival and into the territory of meaning. The bullet scar on her chest faded to silver over time, a thin raised line just below her collarbone that she sometimes touched when she was thinking the way other people touch rings or pendants, a reminder of the night she died and came back, of the 47 seconds when her heart stopped and the world held its breath, and a man who had lost one child refused to lose another. But the family she earned in those 7 steps that was permanent. Because brotherhood isn't about the patch you wear or the club you ride with. It isn't about territory or reputation or the hierarchies of violence that men construct to give structure to their fear. It's about showing up. It's about the willingness to stand between danger and someone who matters to you, even when the cost is everything you have. It's about 7 steps between a dish pit and a corner booth. 7 steps that proved one person, one invisible, starving, unwanted person can change the world. Shelby learned that lesson the hard way, with a bullet and a scar and 47 seconds of darkness in the long, difficult road back to a life that was waiting for her on the other side. But standing in her restaurant on opening night, surrounded by families she had chosen and who had chosen her back, watching Forge wipe his eyes when he thought nobody was looking, she understood that every step had been worth it. Every scar, every nightmare, every 3 a.m. panic attack when the gun was rising and the floor was cold and the darkness was pulling her under. All of it led her here, to a kitchen that smelled like home, to a door that said nobody eats alone, to a life built on the radical, stubborn, unreasonable belief that showing up for someone is the most powerful thing a human being can do. She had shown up for Forge. Forge had shown up for her. And 260 strangers had shown up for both of them because courage is contagious and kindness isn't contagious. And the simple act of giving a damn about another person's survival turns out to be the most viral thing in the world. Shelby touched the scar beneath her shirt, felt the smooth silver line where a bullet had entered and everything had changed. Through the kitchen window, Forge caught her eye, raised his coffee cup, smiled the smile of a man who had been given a second chance and knew exactly how rare that was. She smiled back. Then she turned to the next order, picked up her spatula, and kept building.